Hello, you're very welcome. And this is lecture number 4. Thank you. Thank you. I haven't been keeping count. There are 6 in all, so you know, we're halfway there, just over halfway there. And I suppose with the celebration of the victory of the suffragettes, which is currently in the UK a big thing, it's quite apt to talk about Irish women artists from the first half of the 20th century, really from the late 19th century through to just after the 1950 watermark, or as it were. And it's in Irish history, this is obviously, as we all know, the key. These are the key decades. These are the decades within which Ireland, politically, the Republic of Ireland, separates from the United Kingdom. But leading up to that, you have through the 1880s and 1890s a complete inversion or reversal of the land tenure system with a series of land acts, starting in 1880 and going right through to the early 20th century. Gladstone's Land Acts and Balfour's Land Acts, which essentially completely changed the whole nature of land ownership in Ireland, and was very important in terms of the transformation of the country into say, well, the Ireland that we know today. Now in Russia, there were similar pressures with the Tsarist regime under incredible pressure. It was a very repressive regime, and of course the Russian Revolution resulted in a violent overthrow of Tsarist Russia, and that had an enormous influence throughout the world, not only in Russia, and had a great influence in France, in the UK, and in the United States. And what we're talking about is really industrialization, modern technology, the sort of technology that you can't switch off even if you want to. The sort of technology that comes to dominate all discussions and environments. This technology that's all pervasive. It's okay, Veronica, don't worry. It's making the point that in the late 19th century, you have industrialization on a scale that was unprecedented, and it was. The result of this industrialization and the rapid growth of cities was that phenomenon that we call modernism. It's really an urban phenomenon, I think, not a rural one. Although, say, throughout Russia you have enormous industrialization programs throughout the country, similarly in America and throughout Europe. So modernism is there in the title. What is modernism? It is a very debated word, modernism. So what do I associate it with? I associate it with the beginnings of steel-framed buildings, factory buildings. I associate it with, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, is it? La Brouste, using an iron frame. I associate it with the Eiffel Tower. I associate it with the development of railways and factories, and you also associate it with technologies such as aviation and high-speed connections and networks of transport systems and telephones and wireless and all of that. But politically and socially, you associate modernism with, broadly speaking, a rejection of religion. Modernism is broadly speaking a rejection of classical values. Now, if you were living in Paris and you were a modernist, you might reject the entire city in this instance, more or less, because, as you know, most of it is classical. There's relatively little modernism throughout the whole Haussmann boulevards and so on. But you do have the Eiffel Tower, and you've got the Gare de l'Est and Gare du Nord, and you have fantastic examples of modernism. But I'd say even today, probably 80% of Paris within the periphery is essentially a classical. It's got classical churches, classical avenues, and the architectural language is, broadly speaking, one of classicism. that's what modernism rejected. And they went for, like Le Corbusier, large windows, broad spans, plain white interiors and exteriors. And in art, it's much more complex because modernism includes expressionism and surrealism and Fauvism and all of these isms that convulsed the art world from the 1870s through to the 1920s, 30s, certainly. And Irish women artists were very, I suppose, poised to experience all of this, but sometimes, as you would understand, at one remove. Because being in Ireland, it's isolated from the United Kingdom, which is isolated from mainland Europe. So, and yet Ireland is also at a crossroads because it's got a strategic position in the Atlantic Ocean. So you have cross currents in Ireland that can create very unusual responses to modernism. Its closeness to America makes it one of the most modern-looking countries in its own way. Its exposure to America, not only through emigration, but also through, the transatlantic connections, puts it in this interesting position. So ideas filtered through in Ireland that are revolutionary and advanced, and you have people then in Ireland who have access. And this is an important point, a distinction to make here, is that the artists that we will look at tonight are artists who had financial independence by and large. They were able to travel. They were able to come to France. They were able to stay for a year or two. And some got scholarships, but most had, ample resources, because in the period that we're talking about, society is still very much divided economically into those who have land and property and resources and investments and returns and all of that, and those who are still really just struggling to eke out a living. And if they emigrate to London, they're working in hotels, or if they go to Chicago, they're working, as train drivers and so on, with little access to the sort of fine art education that was an important component of nearly every artist's life at that time. Now, the artists who came, and this talk tonight is focused on Paris, not only because we're here and it's wonderful, but it's also very important. And it was really where every artist from the world wanted to come in 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910. And you're talking perhaps a population of international artists in this broad area, up as far as Montparnasse, of perhaps 50,000 people, all studying, all coming to Paris. They came from Australia, Canada, Czechoslovakia. They came from Ukraine, from Moscow. They came from the United Kingdom. They came from Ireland. And they came in droves. The École des Beaux-Arts could not possibly have accommodated a fraction of the numbers that arrived in Paris. Now, many weren't really able to stay for any great length of time. They came, they went, they came, they went. The École des Beaux-Arts didn't make life easier because if you were a woman, you could not be a student at the École des Beaux-Arts. It did not admit women until 1897. So those who were coming in 1880, they had to attend colleges that sprang up in response to the demand. And it wasn't just one college or one academy. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more academies throughout Paris, all of them catering largely to international students who were coming from all over the world. So the École des Beaux-Arts lost out and became a bit isolated, and felt that, and so they changed the rules in 1897 and not before time. But we'll look at a couple of the academies that were set up. This is the École des Beaux-Arts, and what have we got? All men. And they really look as if they're having a very good men's evening together. and a fine model there in the center, and they're dressed beautifully, and I guess they were posed for this photograph with plenty of notice. The whole thing seems, to my eye, a bit theatrical, a bit affected, and a bit artificial. Step outside the École des Beaux-Arts, and you're into Bouguereau's atelier at the Académie Julian. It's 1891, it's a painting by David Chalfont. Again, it's men, but you're in Académie Julian. And Académie Julian is one of these independent academies. I think in its lifetime it had perhaps 5 different locations around Paris. And the interesting thing about Académie Julian was it had some ateliers were for women only and some were for men only. So this would be one that was for men only. And they still look studious and so on. The model is, is there 2 models or is there a mirror? No, there are 2 models. So 2 models, and whenever you see a painting or a photograph of these ateliers, you also generally see a big clock, and you know, these were businesses. People joined and they paid perhaps a subscription, perhaps by the day or perhaps by the class, but they were regulated and run with tremendous efficiency. Now we're into Académie Julienne. This is probably in Rue de Berry, where they had the atelier for women, and roughly dating it around 1900. And they seem to me to be as every bit as studious and as you know, professional in their approach to what they're doing as the men are in the earlier photographs. And indeed they were. And indeed it became a kind of signature that in this period, that whereas up to the 1880s, certainly from an Irish perspective, the art students who came to Europe, to the mainland, to the continent, they would come to Paris. They would also come to Antwerp and Bruges. But in the 1870s and before this period we're talking about, it was all male artists. So, you know, you have Walter Osborne and Aloysius O'Kelly and Nathaniel Hill, and those artists who became associated with the Barbizon School, John Lavery and Frank O'Mara. And in the period we're talking about, it was like a tidal wave of women came and overwhelmed the men in a sense, because the major talents seemed to be female. And in the Metropolitan School in Dublin, the art school at the centre of Dublin city, again, while the tutors were mainly male, many of the students were female, and they were winning the Taylor Prize, and they were winning this award and that award, and scooting off to Paris, and they were showing incredible ambition, professionalism, and drive, and it was as if, you know, they were, I suppose, actively creating their own futures. Not only individually, but also collectively. And so at many of these ateliers, the independent ateliers, the students were mainly women. And it was an extraordinary phenomenon artistically. Some still survive even today. This is Académie Julian, here, one of its manifestations. Rue de Dragon, it's not far from Bon Marché. And Colorossi's, that's at Rue de la Grande Chaumière. John Lavery studied here. It seems a little less populated than the others. Perhaps they took the photograph on a quiet day, but you see the clock there and the easels all set out and the model clothed and unclothed. It was also a convention that women students could not draw in the formal academies, if you like, the École des Beaux-Arts and Metropolitan School in Dublin and so on. They could not draw from the nude male model. But if they came to these independent academies, they could, and they did. And who came? Edith Somerville came from West Cork. And the sketch she made in Collarossi's studio in 1886. And she was one of these absolutely determined artists, and she was quite a new type of woman in Ireland. Now, the artists that we're looking at, by and large, as I've said, they came from the upper classes or the upper middle classes or the middle upper classes and the landed classes, professional classes. They had money and they could travel. But they also worked phenomenally hard. And as we saw in some of the previous talks, you know, there was a kind of work ethic that drove them to create, and throughout their lifetimes, in a whole variety of areas. You know, there was never any sense of sitting still. These were not flaneurs. These were not people who just floated about Paris enjoying the city. They were incredibly dedicated. And Edith Somerville, she embraced modernism in a certain way. Not through her work. She remained a realist painter. One of the distinctions I would make, broadly speaking, is that realism, Courbet and so on, is sort of pre-modern. It's got a lot of the modernist thinking in it, but the adherence to realism, you know, Millet, the Gleaners and all of that, it doesn't matter how socially conscious or politically aware, they're still, you know, locked into this classical framework of realist painting, of perspective, of the whole Renaissance kit and caboodle that we're so familiar with, that Picasso and Braque and others were to, you know, really turn on its head in the first decade of the 20th century. So Edith Somerville, when she returned to Ireland, she became a farmer, a master of hounds. She became an author. She wrote a whole series of books, and her novel, The Real Charlotte, is a good novel, well written. It's striking. You know, she was very talented as a writer. She bred horses. She was an independent person. She never married. She had a relationship with Violet Ross. They wrote together under the Violet Martin. They wrote together under the pseudonym Somerville and Ross. And you'd be familiar with some of the stories of life in the countryside. So she came to Paris. There are drawings by her of Pasteur's studio, which was not far away from here. And, you know, she was keenly interested in a whole wide range of things. A very modern woman, but her work is her paintings that she created when she went back to Ireland, although invested with this strong sense of social realism. They're paintings which don't embrace the modernism, say, of Cézanne or Picasso or Braque. So what did they say when she said she was going to come to Paris to study art? Paris, they said this at the tops of their voices. They said that Paris was the Scarlet Woman embodied. They also said the idea of letting a girl go to Paris. This, they said incessantly in capital letters. And my mother was frightened. So a compromise was effected, and I went to Paris with a bodyguard consisting of my mother, my eldest brother, a female cousin, and with us another girl. And that was what the idea of coming to Paris was greeted with. But she would come to Paris because she knew that it was happening in Paris. The men who I mentioned who came from Ireland to study on the continent in the 1870s and 80s, they went to Antwerp. It was safe, bourgeois. There were no revolutionary tendencies there. Their parents could rest assured that they'd be well looked after at the academy, at the Royal Academy in Brussels or in Antwerp. And this is Rue de la Grande Chaumière, and a photograph taken around 1900. And it's really got a lovely characteristic to it, and it seems more light-filled and more cheerful than you see it in this snapshot, which I took at 4 p.m. this afternoon while I was walking here in the rain. And it's, seems nowadays to be rather narrow and grim and lined with wheelie bins and motorcycles. But you still see the Académie de la Grande Chaumière there. The sign is out and the flag is up. And again, these academies seem to have an extraordinary resilience in Paris. Some of them are, in fact, I would warrant that some of them are probably reviving and thriving today because of the renewed interest that there, I think, has taken place, certainly in I'm not sure, so in France, I'm sure, and in the UK and in Ireland, in life drawing and in drawing from the model and in sort of a more classical training. One of the tenets of modernism would have been, and this was common throughout art schools throughout the 1950s and 60s, throughout the UK, throughout Ireland and in France too, was what was life drawing for? What did it mean, you know, as a discipline? It seemed sort of a very antediluvian, a very recherché sort of discipline to draw from the life model. But in the past 20 years, there's been a considerable revival of interest. So this is La Grande Chaumière, and Ossip Zadkine still has his plate up there, although he is long since gone. And Paris preserves some of its artistic integrity. Who studied at these academies? Who were the artists who came from Ireland? Grace Henry is one. Now, as soon as we talk about Grace Henry, you immediately open up one question. She's born in Aberdeenshire. She's Scottish. She comes to Paris. She meets Paul Henry. He's from Northern Ireland. They get married 1903, and they come. Then they go back to Ireland together, and she spends a great deal of the rest of her life in Ireland. So Grace Henry, although born in Aberdeenshire, is a founder member of the Dublin Painters Gallery and exhibits at the Dublin Painters Gallery. And she's, but you know, so she can be equally claimed by Scotland or by Ireland. And she came back to Paris to study under André Lhote. André Lhote was a very influential teacher in Paris, somebody who took the tenets of Cubism but ameliorated them and created a type of Cubism that was, broadly speaking, what came to be known as the School of Paris. That this was a style of more muted Cubism. And she also studied at the Académie de l'Éclair. This is the Clanta Market in Galway, and we saw drawings by Dunoyer of Galway, and this would have been quite close by. It's in the west of Ireland. And this is her painting, Top of the Hill, of people in the west of Ireland. She and Paul Henry went to Achill Island. It was really out in the wilds of the west of Ireland, and her husband worked for the Congested. He had a government job, so that gave them a little bit of an income. But otherwise, they painted, and they lived there for about 9 or 10 years. And they had both studied in Paris. They had studied at various ateliers, but probably the most influential factor was Whistler. They'd both studied at Whistler's Academy, and Alphonse Mouchat too. So there's sort of strong graphic poster-like quality. I mentioned André Lhote, and you know, André Lhote is more influential probably as a teacher than he is as an artist. The painting here is slightly decorative. It doesn't have the same bite as those paintings that you would be familiar with by Juan Gris and Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso from 1910. But nonetheless, André Lhote did write a number of works, and his treatise on painting was very influential, and his school was very, very influential. And he was very, you know, careful in working out, I suppose, an approach to art, and he was able to communicate that. So he was extremely influential among the artists who came to Paris. This is the treatise on landscape and figure that he wrote. And he looked back into the history of art, and he looked back at painters such as Patinier in this landscape, and he would analyze it in terms of the way color was used and the way certain senses of depth were created. So when one of his students then from Ireland, Nora Mcginnis, who was born in Derry in 1903 and trained at the Metropolitan School before she came to Paris, when she creates this Irish landscape in the 1950s, you can see how she learned from André Lhote. And you can see how she learned from André Lhote looking at Netherlandish painting of several centuries before, analyzing, look at the way the dark and lights areas are used to create a sort of sense of vibrancy and depth in that landscape. That's the small fields of Donegal. And this is the Holy Well at Ardmore. Again, we've come across this in previous talks, Ardmore and the Round Tower there in County Waterford. Nora Mcginnis was very professional. She epitomized this new generation of artists. She was a member, she went to London, she was a member of Lucy Wertheim's London group. That included Elizabeth Frink and Victor Passmore and well-known artists of the era. And she returned to Ireland then, 1939. When the Second World War broke out, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, was neutral. And therefore, quite a number of artists from the continent and from all over headed for Dublin, particularly because they would not be conscripted into the armed forces, and if they were conscientious objectors or poets or writers or musicians or felt they had no role to play in this war, they could live it out in Ireland, and they did. And so Ireland and Dublin from 1939 to 1945 became this sort of damp Casablanca full of spies and refugees and people looking for visas and papers, and a lot of them were chancers, but there were also like very serious artists, and Basil Rakushi came, and the White Stag group, came, bringing a sort of Central European interest in psychoanalysis, and Kenneth Hall came, and Elizabeth Rivers, who was a great friend of Nora Mcginnis too. And the artistic life in Dublin blossomed in those years paradoxically. Why? Because Ireland was very isolated because of the war. People could not afford, if they could afford to buy a refrigerator, they couldn't buy one because they weren't being imported. If you wanted a new car, it was impossible. There weren't many people churning out new cars in those days. It was all about tanks. And so in Ireland, people bought paintings. So interestingly, those years, 1940, 41, 42, saw the blossoming of galleries such as the Victor Waddington Gallery that still goes today in London and is a major international gallery, and a host of other galleries got off the ground then, and their legacy is still very much part of today's art world in Ireland. And artists could make a living. Jack Yates, who we will look at next week, could make quite a good living during these years. The Irish Exhibition of Living Art was founded in 1943. Louis Le Brocquet, Nora Mcginnis, and other progressive painters were part of that group. Manny Jellett, Evie Hone. These were pretty much all artists who'd come to Paris. They had all studied at Académie Julian, Delacruz, Colarossi, Grand Chaumier, and when they went back to Ireland, they were in no way content to live under the kind of rather oppressive and male-dominated regime of the Royal Hibernian Academy, and they were setting up their own academy, their own annual exhibition. It was called the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, and it was a fantastic, positive, and very popular too. So Nora Mcginnis continued throughout the 1950s and 60s to paint in this André Lhote-inspired style. Essentially, you could call it School of Paris, and that's her there supervising the men who are putting up the paintings. And you've got Jack Hanlon, Louis Le Brocquet up the ladder, and Elizabeth Curran, who organized an important exhibition of Irish art that toured in the United States at the time. And you have Nora Mcginnis there and Margaret Clark. Nano Reid was a great friend of Nora Mcginnis, and Nano Reid also came to Paris, and she studied at one of these ateliers, and this is a painting which again shows the André Lotte influence, but it's much more personal, and it's much more, you know, visceral. You can really feel the kind of way she's engaging with the paint, with the actual paint itself. Nora Mcginnis tends to use paint in order to create a color, a depth, but Nana Reid actually seems to paint, you know, with paint as a substance. So there's something visceral and very powerful about this. Nana Reid is somewhat unusual in the artist we're looking at, in the sense that she didn't have a grand income. I think her family had a pub in Drogheda, and you know, she would sell paintings in order to try and make a living if she could, but she never compromised on her artistic vision in order to create works which the sort of tourist market would have liked. Irish landscapes, you know, with little green valleys and lovely hills and fields and cattle and so on. Her work is always very, very personal, very poetic, and she had a lovely poetic vision. So unlike some of the artists who we look at, who kind of learned all of the architecture of modernism and were able to reproduce it, Nana Reid learned the kind of inner voice, if you like, of modernism, which is that emphasis on the individual, the personal, the authentic, the true, rather than the forced and artificial. And this is, she was strongly socially conscious too, and decorated the Four Seasons Ballroom in Dublin, which was a building owned by trade unions, and you know, so she was committed in a political sense, and committed her art to the progress of these social and political values. And there's a lovely poetic sense, as I say, in her work. With Evie Hone, you're dealing with somebody from a completely different social background. Evie Hone, you know, came from a long generation, an eminent family in Dublin. And although she suffered from infantile paralysis, which partially crippled her from the age of about 11, you know, her family would take her to Italy and to Spain and so on, trying to, and she went to various places to try and effect a cure for this condition, but she never really did. But nonetheless, she had a very privileged life, and so at the age of 11, she was in Italy at Assisi and looking at Giotto's paintings and so on. So she was given this extraordinary and wonderful introduction to art by her family from a very early age. And in looking at the artists that we have over the past 2 or 3 talks, many of them, as we mentioned, in the 17th, 18th century, came from Netherlandish backgrounds and or Flemish backgrounds, and so indeed did the Hones originally, coming to Ireland from Flanders. And she and Evie Hone ended up making stained glass windows, which is interesting because her ancestor in the 17th century had made stained glass windows for King's College in Cambridge in England. So, you know, these are very, very strongly kind of integrated families with an extraordinary sense of continuity. So she attended art school in London, and then she came to Paris, and she came with Mamie Jellett to study with André Lotte. And then they went to study with Albert Glazes. Albert Glazes is an important figure in Cubism in Paris in 1900, 1910, 1920, 1925. He was one of the great theorists of the Cubist movement. And I think his work is interesting because he kind of represents a tension You have Picasso, Braque, and Juan Gris developing, as you know, in 1907, almost month by month, even week by week, a new approach, frottage, collage, introducing different materials, putting in a piece of bamboo, tram tickets, this sort of thing, breaking down perspective, fragmenting the picture plane, all of these advances. It was astonishing, the rapidity. Glazes came along and wrote a book. This is what Cubism is. And of course, that's in terms of the real, tumble of Cubism and these different movements is the antithesis. So he sort of sets up a kind of a church, if you like, of Cubism. And this is Cubism, and these are the rules of Cubism. So although his work is apparently modern, personally, I find it akin to these paintings behind you here, which are purely classical and which are based upon, the eternal academic laws. He set up a new academy. Now, funnily enough, he didn't have an academy, Glazes. He codified it and wrote treatises on Cubism. And he produced a large Cubist painting that's currently in Tokyo called The Harvest. And it kind of epitomizes that in the sense that it's sort of rather grand classical subject matter, but it's dressed up in the new clothes, as it were, of the 20th century. Evie Hone and Manny Gellet went to his studio and they said, we want to be your pupils, we want to be your students. He said, I don't take students on. He didn't know who he was reckoning with. They said, you're taking us on. And he said, no, I don't have a... They said, you're taking us on. And eventually he said, oh, okay. And he took them on. And they began to run him instead of he running them. And they said, you've done this work, but now we'd like to see you improve. And so these were formidable women, I can tell you. And so Glazes did improve. And when you look at his early work from 1915, 16, 17, he's obviously sort of slightly floundering. But when he gets Hone and Manny Gellet into the studio and they're saying, what do we do now? Tell us exactly, please. His work improves markedly. And so there was an extraordinary relationship between these two formidable Irish students and this, very accomplished French progressive painter. So what do you get? You get Evie Hone here, and this is a classic Evie Hone cubist, so synthetic cubism. Glazes had adopted a formula of transformation and rotation, which was quite formalized, but you can see the effect here. This is Glazes himself, a painting by him. To me, there's hardly much to distinguish that from the work of Evie Hone that we've just seen. This is what Albert Glazes was doing in 1912, a decade before he took on these students. This is a large, powerful painting, the harvest thrashing, and you can see how he's sort of firing on all cylinders, but it's not in some ways resolved because it has this academic feeling to it. Gellet and Hone went back to Dublin and they introduced Cubism to Irish audiences. In 1924, the first exhibition they had was in the Dublin Painters Gallery. And, this is a paradigm and it's a strong stereotype, that the critics were aghast and people were, expostulating. What is this? People couldn't understand it. I think that's, in my view, a little over-egged. This is 1924. The Vorticists had been showing similar work in London 10 years before that. The Cubists had been showing, in the first decade of the 20th century. The Armory show in New York with 1,600 progressive works, including Marcel Duchamp's Nous, Descending a Staircase, had been held in New York in 1913, 11 years earlier. People in Ireland, in the art world particularly, and critics and so on, would have been very familiar with that. So, but nonetheless, the narrative exists and the reviews are sort of suitably, But I think that the reviewers were looking also at something about what I've mentioned, which is to do with the fact that they had frozen in aspic this codified method of painting in this modern style. Evie Hone again, an abstract composition. Ménie Gellet, an abstract composition. And Ménie Gellet, homage to Fra Angelico. Both women, although coming from ascendancy and Protestant backgrounds, were very open to and receptive of patronage from the Catholic Church. Evie Hone became a Catholic in 1937. Ménie Gellet's mother used to go down to the Magdalen Church on Leeson Street, where the illegitimate children would hear Mass behind a brown curtain, while their mothers were in the gallery concealed from them and from other members of the church up in the balcony. And this is where she attended church herself. That was the Ireland of the day. But nonetheless, their work isn't full of the sort of protest now that is kind of ubiquitous and universal in terms of that system that operated in those years. They were both very devout, and they both really looked to the church, as you can see here, and to the history of religious art with the sense of genuine devotion. Evie Hone's time in a convent only lasted 2 years. She didn't really have a vocation, but these were women who were not, you know, they were so absorbed in the search, in a spiritual search. And we're back to Gellet here, back to glazes here. There are art experts who can distinguish between these artists' work, and I'm not sure that I can so easily. They say that Hone paints more with the heart and Ménie Gellet paints more with the head, but that there are times when they're virtually echoing and mirroring. Now, Evie Hone did move into this style, and she did stained glass, as I said, and she follows the artist, of course, again, Rouault, Rouault, the French art, and so she's developing that more emotional thing. This is a sketch for a window. She's commissioned to do this window for the New York World Trade Fair in 1939. And the window is in government buildings in Dublin today. You can see the religious element in her work in the Stations of the Cross, 1946. And these are very satisfying works artistically. She was extraordinarily dedicated. The death of Ménie Gellet in 1944 left her somewhat isolated, but she quietly continued to work. And then her major commission was for a stained glass window in Eton College. This is in King's Court in Cavan. And this is the one in Eton College, which is 1949 to 52, which is it's 1,000 square feet. It's a very large window. And this sort of cemented her position as an artist who had engaged with modernism and engaged also, though, with religion and tradition. And she'd managed to synthesize these, inspired by the love of the stained glass in Chartres Cathedral and those windows that she had seen when she was in Paris. A great friend of Ménie Gellet was Mcginnis, La Parisienne, 1925. And one of the considerable number of artists. Mary Swansea, too, with this Samoan scene. Mary Swansea came from the same sort of background, medical family, well off, and so she was able to travel around the world. She left Ireland essentially and traveled as an artist after her education, after being brought up in Ireland. But this also was the time of the Troubles in Ireland, and a member of her family had been shot and killed because he was in the Royal Irish Constabulary and was considered a legitimate target by Sinn Féin, so they shot him and killed him. And so she left the country and didn't really return. So this is, there are stories of kind of hidden tragedies here. Ménie Gellet's mum, when there was a Sinn Féin strike in Dublin, she said it was a black disgrace. These were not families that were inclined to take, moderate positions, if you like. Ménie Gellet's father was a prominent unionist, and had been elected, for Trinity College to a unionist seat. So these were families who were, in one sense, on the wrong side of history. And yet what's very interesting is the way when the Civil War went the way it did, and when Ireland, the Irish Free State, is founded, they accommodate and they negotiate, and Mamie Jellett becomes a leading force in the contemporary art world, as does Evie Hone, as does Louis Le Brocquet and Melanie Le Brocquet, and others, who under other circumstances, given the upheavals that had taken place, could well have thrown their hat at it and left. But Mary Swansea, she did. I think she was very traumatized and upset by the assassination, and you just traveled the world. You'd find her sort of exhibiting in California or somewhere. She was a very accomplished artist, Mary Swansea, and followed that Cubist idea, but with a very personal and strongly, it's quite very imaginative and very strong, very committed, and she's an artist to be reckoned with. Joan Jemison, less so, but an artist nonetheless who figures in the story. Joan Jemison, think of whiskey, think of the family, think of the artist. That's her. But very, very talented, and a great friend of Nora Mcginnis's and Molly Keane, and all the sort of group of writers and painters who did live through an era in the 1940s and 50s in particular, when Ireland was very isolated, and yet they contrived to have fulfilled lives, as did Hilda Roberts. She's in Paris, 1925, and that's a little cafe sketch full of the flavor of the time. She had a great eye, and it's a pity she didn't do more sketches. She's a very talented artist. When she was a teenager, she did this, and then she's a boring young man. There's a wonderful sense of that, but it's also, you could locate that very much in the time of George Grosz, or New Sachlichkeit, as they call it, and to a lesser extent this, which is full of a sense of urban anxiety, this sketch of a man in a crowded street. Her portraits are direct and honest, and again, rather like Edith Somerville, although she did not embrace Cubism or a codified version of modernism, there's a very direct feeling in this that and so she's a minor but important figure in Irish art of the period. Some very personal works, and reflecting her own anxieties and feelings and fears and so on. She married the headmaster of a good school, Newtown School in County Waterford, and she then became, Mrs. Arnold Marsh. So after a stellar beginning to her career after the marriage to the headmaster, that's more or less it. She then became the person who was looking after the school, but she did found the Waterford Municipal Art Collection in the 1940s, and she kind of kept going. So again, a remarkable woman. And her house, where they lived in Rathfarnham in Dublin when they retired, became the place where Morris Graves moved when he came over from the United States and settled in Ireland for a decade. An interesting, almost a colony for artists. Now we get to Eileen Gray. Here was another woman, large house, County Wexford. Upbringing, mother is a baroness. Mother inherits the baronetcy, changes her name to Gray, puts turrets all over the house. Eileen is less than impressed and says, I'm out of here. So Eileen, she's bisexual. She's very independent. She's quite extraordinary. She goes to art school in London, as so many others did. That's her looking quite Edwardian, around 1900. She apprenticed herself to a lacquer craftsman whom she met in London around 1905, but then she came to Paris, and because she had money, she could buy an apartment, which she did in Rue Bonaparte, and a roadster. And she made these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. This is a lacquered screen from 1913, made in Paris. She formed a collaboration with the Japanese lacquer artist who'd come over for the Exposition Universelle. She's photographed by Bernice Abbott. Now she's nearly 48 years of age there. But 1926 is the photograph. But nonetheless, you can see how she has embraced modernism in a way I think that none of the other artists we're talking about did. But yet she did so in a very personal way. This is a chaise longue, pirogue, it's called a canoe, tortoiseshell finish, and the lacquered screen behind. These are extraordinary works by any standards, and to have what happened to Eileen Gray happen is like beyond belief, because she was basically forgotten about. The house that she designed in Cap Saint-Martin or Cap Martin, Roquebrune, was attributed to other architects. So it was only just before her death, 1975, that a few people woke up to the fact that there was this extraordinary woman living in an apartment in Rue Bonaparte who had these marvelous things that she had made in the first decades of the 20th century. And then it just took off. This chair sold for 21 million euro. So it took off like a rocket about 15 years ago. Unbelievable. Now, Damia, anybody know Damia? Yeah, I get it. Was she the lover of? We don't know. We don't know. But Damia was famous for walking around Paris with a panther, I think, on a leash. And she and Eileen Gray would be whizzing around the boulevards in Eileen's roadster. The screen that she designed, it's first exhibited in 1923. The originals of this are selling for 1.2 million, I think. So again, this is extraordinary. And it is a magnificent work of art and a work of architecture and an interior designer, because perhaps she was just outside the sort of conventional framework of paintings on canvas or gouache, or etching, because she occupied this nebulous zone. It might not have been easy to accommodate her. And she opened her gallery, Jean Dessert, 1922 on Faubourg Saint-Honoré. She got some commissions to do design work in Paris in those years. This is the apartment at Rue de Lota, designed for Juliette Levy in 1922. And you see the dragon chair there and the bibendum chair there. And these again are all have become icons of the 20th century. Now here's the two men who both helped and hindered. And Baldovici is a Romanian art critic and the editor of an architectural magazine. He's great friends with Le Corbusier, who is the great god of 20th century modernism. And in the middle you have Eileen Gray. So Baldovici profiled her in the 1924 edition of his magazine, L'Architecture Vivante. Baldovici had very little money, so he kind of saw his opportunities and he took them. And she designed a house for him when they were together. He was about 15 years younger than her. This is the house that she designed for him. It's in Roquebrune, and E1027, meaning Eileen, and Jeanne is the 10, and You know, so there's a code. Two is B, Badavici, and so on. So the name is a code for their numerical code for their names. It is being restored, I believe, by the French government as a sort of national monument. So we can applaud that. After about 10 years, she got fed up with Badavici's womanizing and his drinking and his behavior in general, and she skedaddled and built her own house. But then Badavici invited in Le Corbusier, who said, I will put my mark upon this house, and he painted his own murals all over the inside. And hence the kind of, you know, appropriation of Eileen Gray's genius and her work in manners that were like, you know, beyond reprehensible. The bibendum chair there, and this is her transat chair there that she also designed. She designed fantastic furniture. That's one of the original murals in the house. And this is Eileen in her old age in her apartment in Rue Bonaparte with the brick screen behind. Although she'd had a very colorful life and knew extraordinary people and had been in the most amazing kind of situations, she was very meticulous, and before her death she burned all of her correspondence so that you or I will never know what happened. And she was very discreet. The Pompidou Centre mounted an exhibition of hers in 2013. I should say, you know, that I studied art history in Ireland for 5, 6, 7 years. I was completely unaware of this name, of this Irish artist, throughout my that period. So, but then the world was too. So well done, Pompidou. We're going to finish. We're astonishingly ahead of ourselves this week, but we're going to. It's not for want of interesting material, but I did think I couldn't make, you know, it just, you know, the last sessions were just too long, so I am going to try and keep it to an hour. And we're going to finish on this, another forgotten artist, Clare Sheridan. Again, you might find her in biographies sometimes listed as an English artist, but her father owned an estate in Cork, in Inishannon, in County Cork, and she spent her childhood there, also at a convent in Paris, where she was so overwhelmed by the whole experience that she decided that she would become a Catholic too. And she's quite a remarkable woman. She, rather like Edith Somerville, you know, she embraced modernism in a certain way. I think more the flavor of the 20th century, the revolutionary spirit. Her work remains generally Art Deco-ish or conventional, or in the spirit of, say, Epstein. And she admired his work, Jacob Epstein, very much. So, in Inishannon, County Cork, it's not, you know, where the place that you might imagine that such a talent and a personality might emerge from. But the rent rolls are there. These documents relate to a particular time in history when the tenants were, you know, the local families paying rent to her father. Her father, by the way, Morton Fruin, also went by the nickname Mortal Ruin. And whatever he turned his hand to, he lost money on it. And no matter how well-intentioned he was, he did seem to alienate people wherever he went. His experiences in Wyoming were particularly unfortunate, where his ambition to take 48,000 acres of the Powder Creek Ranch in the 1880s and turn it into a giant money-making concern for a group of English aristocrats foundered after a series of hard winters and droughts, and the cattle died. It's not far from Little Bighorn. the lands had been conveniently cleared by the 7th Cavalry and others, so the native inhabitants had been moved out, and these tens of thousands of acres were open for English milords to come. There's a book called The Virginian, which some may have heard of, and it's a famous book. It sold 1 million copies, and it's essentially about the range wars in Johnson County, which is where these events took place. Almost the last private war in the United States took place in Johnson County when the English milords hired Texas Rangers to come up and defend their great ranches against the smallholders who were settling, in Johnson County and stealing cattle. Now, Morton, when he became a cowboy, did so with great elan and great flair, and he had a cowboy outfit made for himself, as the English milords liked to do. And he built a log cabin out on the plains, and anyway, it didn't go well, and he lost money on that. And he retreated back to Inishannon, to his house on the, it's not far from Bandon, on the Bandon River. The convent of the Assumption in Auteuil in Paris is where his daughter was sent, Clare Sheridan. This is her portrait by Jacob Epstein. She wanted to study with Epstein, but Epstein said, I don't take on students. We've heard this before. He said, well, I will commission you to make a bust of me, and you will come and make the bust, and I will watch you at work. And so she did, and she learned from him. And what did she do with that talent? She took herself to Moscow in 1920, and she presented herself with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and the leaders of the Bolshevik Party, and she said, I'm going to make your portrait busts. And they put a large house at her disposal, and she went in every day into the Kremlin, and she made busts of Kamenev, of Trotsky, of Lenin. These are remarkable people. Her cousin was Winston Churchill. He was not impressed with this. When his cousin came back to London after doing all these portraits of the Bolshevik leaders, there was a discussion as to what did she think she was up to. But anyway, she didn't really care. And she exhibited the busts in New York, where they created an even greater sensation. But that was because of the way of the world as it was, that her grandfather was Jerome, and he was called the King of Wall Street. And so she was one of these extraordinary mixtures of Wall Street money, Irish, sort of Anglo-Irish aristocracy, and so on. But she had interviews with Lenin about, Lenin would say to her as she was sculpting his portrait, your cousin, I don't like him. And she would try and, she would try and not necessarily defend her family, but she did point out to Lenin that her other cousin, Shane Leslie, was a committed Sinn Féiner. So Lenin observed that the family get-togethers must be quite interesting in that case. And, she was celebrated, and she wrote a book about her experiences. And she was probably a lover of Leon Trotsky. She was very passionate in these engagements that she had. That's her working away on the bust of Lenin. And so when she gets to America, then Charlie Chaplin is quite an interesting figure in the kind of cultural time. Think of Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin and other films he made, which are veering towards communism, veering very much on the side of the worker, veering away from capitalist America and the Vanderbilts and indeed the Jeromes and all of that. So Chaplin invites her out to Hollywood, and they spend 2 weeks together, and she makes a bust of Chaplin, and he does so on the basis of he's so pleased with the book she wrote. And Chaplin himself is a very interesting figure, as I say. They take a tent and a car, and they go off down on the beach, and they camp out, and they're there for about 3 or 4 days before the press get wind of it, and suddenly there are cars appearing in all directions, and they have to flee. But Chaplin was very formative. This bust is in the Chaplin Museum. He was not allowed back into the United States. He was advised to leave because of his left-wing sympathies. And he settled in Switzerland. And it was only perhaps after 25 years that the Academy of whatever said, oh, we'll give you a Lifetime Achievement Award, and he went back to Hollywood. He was then in his 80s. He was told really by the whoever authorities, leave this country. And he was exiled, Charlie Chaplin. So in this museum in Switzerland that has recently opened, this bust by Clare Sheridan is on prominent display. Her work, she never, unlike Eileen Gray, you know, who left this sort of Art Deco feel behind her and moved into this resolute modernism, Clare did not, but she's a vivid writer. And when she went to Russia again, she wrote a book about it too. And when she went to Russia, she traveled, as you can see, in some style, crossed Europe on a motorcycle, wrote these many books, and then came back to Ireland and settled in Oranmore Castle, where she became quite a figure in County Galway. And she lived first in beside the Spanish Arch, the building that's now part of the Galway Museum. And this is her, you know, advanced enough in years, but supervising the raising of a medieval chest up, hoisting it up into the castle. That's her working on a piece for an Irish church. She did, you know, she was quite religious, and in Oranmore today, this is a snapshot I took, you know, not so long ago. They still have some of her busts of Trotsky and Lenin and so on. And she was gravely disappointed when they built that new cathedral in Galway. She expected to get a commission, and when the bishop said, I'm not having any of that, she was working on an angel at the time, and it was thrown down outside Oranmore Castle, and it's still there today, buried in the grass. Clare Sheridan. So, you know, we've looked tonight at a number of different artists, and we've looked at artists who embraced modernism, embraced the 20th century, who did so with enormous courage and great fortitude and great resilience, and some who prospered and became sort of stellars, others who were obliterated from the record for decades, completely without justification, and others who trudged along, you know, as best they could and lived lives as best they could. But it's a fantastic testament to the power of art and their love of it, that they achieved what they did. And, you know, today hardly a year goes by and there's not another discovery of another such talent. Ireland, of course, you will understand, because it has been dominated by writers, they will say there's no visual tradition in Ireland. And it's, you know, such a, you know, I've never heard such nonsense. There's so much visual tradition in Ireland. It's simply that it's never been really properly recognized in the way that I think it is in France, as we all know. That is one thing that you can complain about things here, but not that. So thank you very much.